Afternoon. First, let me thank all of you for coming out today in this rather mercurial weather. Today is the sixth of our 9 lectures that are being supported in total or in part by the African American Heritage House. We're 2/3 of the way now with today's lecture through our inaugural season. And each week seems to get better and better, and today's presentation is certainly going to amplify and reinforce that trajectory. My name is Errol Davis. I am privileged to serve as the chair of the board of the African American Heritage House here at the Chautauqua Institution. The AAHH, as we call it, is an organization which is informed by the African American experience and committed to strengthening Chautauqua by encouraging and welcoming diversity, fostering honest conversations, and adding new voices to the programmatic mix. In the finest Chautauqua tradition, after today's presentation, there's going to be a moderated Q&A session. Tomorrow, not today, but tomorrow at 12:15 at the African American Heritage House, which is at 38 Clark, right down about half a block on the brick walk there in the corner of Foster, there will be a Chautauqua dialogue. These dialogues are sponsored by the Department of Religion, but hosted by the African American Heritage House. And the focus of tomorrow's dialogue will be your reactions to the comments that you will hear today. I know often when I go to a speech, I have some comments that I might want to share, and we would prefer that you do it at the dialogue versus in the Q&A here today. Our post-talk dialogues are really a success story in themselves because of the growing number of people that want to engage in these post-talk conversations. We have had to make arrangements with an adjoining denominational house to accommodate overflow. So we will now be able to provide for even better conversations and more intimate conversations by keeping the discussion groups at a manageable size. So I would encourage you to do join your fellow Chautauquans in this conversation tomorrow at 12:15 at 38 Clark. Today's presentation is made possible in part through the generosity of Deb and Ted First, longtime Chautauquan residents, as well as a number of other generous supporters. And would you please join me in thanking Deb and Ted and others for making this possible. My last announcement concerns cell phones. I would appreciate if you would put it on stun so that the speaker may speak uninterrupted here today. 2019, of course, is the 400th anniversary of the introduction of slavery in America, and we are pleased to present a season-long lecture series relating to the experience of African Americans and other marginalized people over the last 400 years. And as I look back over the last 5 weeks, we've had a number of academic historians as well as a dynamic young politician, Stacey Abrams, speak from this podium. But through all of the lectures, the point was made time and time again that we can learn from both the past as well as the present. But we've also seen time and time again that the realities of the last 400 years for African Americans were and are different from what many of you here today have experienced or perhaps will experience in your lifetimes. Today's speaker is Micheal Moore, who is not a trained historian or a maker of documentary films, but one whose work and life are deeply rooted in the African American experience. He is the great grandson of a Civil War hero and Reconstruction era Congressman Robert Smalls. Micheal and I have a lot in common. We both started our careers in the business world before coming to an understanding that it is possible to do both well and good at the same time. Fortunately for all of us, however, he came to this realization a lot sooner than I did. His focus on social justice issues is profound, and he is committed to having an impact on our society today. Michael's roots, as I noted, are steeped in history, and his work over the last 4+ years has been as well. He is the founding president and CEO of the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. And in that capacity, he has led a team that has raised over $100 million to finance this newest African American museum. When asked why are we building so many new museums dedicated to chronicling the African American experience, Michael's response is one that he's going to explore in some detail with us here today. And the answer to that question very simply is that the farther we look back, the farther ahead we can see. His credentials are long and impressive, and as is our tradition, we're not going to spend a lot of time going over them here. They are in the paper today, and there are also programs on the back table if you haven't gotten a program that do in fact list his very impressive credentials. Please join me in giving a warm Chautauqua welcome to Micheal Moore.
Well, hello, everyone. I have to tell you, this is my first time here. It took me, 57 years to discover this place, but I guarantee you I will be back. This has been something of a whirlwind trip. I've been here for about 24 hours, and when I was making the schedule here, I knew I had a meeting in New York City early tomorrow afternoon, and so I asked my assistant, okay, you just need to get me there as quickly as I can. And she said, okay, I'll do that. And so to make a long story short, my driver is coming to pick me up tomorrow at 2:45 a.m. to go to Buffalo to take the train down to Manhattan. So I say all that to say that I'll be back. And I am so impressed and moved by the spirit that I sense here. The people, everyone is focused on intellectual and spiritual renewal, uplift, and at that, I just think it's a marvelous thing. So I'm honored to be here, and thank you so much for coming. There's obviously lots that is going on here, so I appreciate the fact that you're here. As Errol said, I'm not a historian. I'm a business person, but my life has been framed by history in sort of powerful ways. I grew up, and I'll talk about him a little bit more in detail a little bit further in the talk, but I grew up knowing about my great-great-grandfather, Robert Smalls, knowing of his exploits, and as I said, I'll get into that. But that gave me sort of interesting perspective. I also grew up in a family of educators. Both my parents are educators, both my grandfathers were educators, and so school and learning and academic pursuits were things that were very much valued and honored in our family. But all of that sort of created an interesting relationship or juxtaposition with history as I grew up. I remember having a really distinct sense of being perplexed when I was maybe in third grade, third grade, when I heard the teacher, and by the way, like most good students, the teacher says it, and in particular, if it's in the book, it must be so, right? But the teacher said, Christopher Columbus discovered America. And I remember as a youngster just like, how does that work? There are people here, millions of them, who've been here for thousands of years. Like, how does that discover thing work? And then I remember in middle school, a little bit older, hearing the heavy words of our founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And they were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet I knew that didn't apply to my ancestors. I knew that didn't apply to women. I knew that didn't apply to most even white men. It was white men of wealth and property ownership. So the words just didn't, I couldn't connect the dots on them. So perhaps cynically at the time, I came, not in these words, but I came to the understanding that maybe history was less of a literal articulation of events, a recitation of this happened, and that happened, and that happened, and maybe it was more a tool of social construction. Maybe history was the stories that people wanted to leave behind, that they wanted their grandchildren to know about them. And then I started, as I got older, to understand the role that power plays in history and who's telling the history. There's an African proverb that says that until the lion gets its own historian, the history of the hunt will always favor the hunter. And that seems to be true, although there is an interesting anomaly for that, and that, I think, in some ways is the Civil War, right? The United States, the North, won the war, but in many ways the South won the narrative of the war. Certainly in the South. I live now in a city, Charleston, that has built its history and certainly its economy around a certain narrative of history that is maybe a convenient narrative, that things weren't that bad, that everyone loved each other, that we didn't treat anybody badly, and we know that history was a bit more complicated than that, but so be it. So I guess the point that I'm starting to try to make is that history empowers sort of narratives, historical narratives that come to guide how people think and feel, and sort of creates the platform for contemporary thinking. One of my favorite quotes, and I'll say this with apologies to Errol, who has a long association with General Motors, but one of my favorite quotes is from Henry Ford, who said, "Whether you think you can or not, you're right." Whether you think you can or not, you're right. And to me, that, I think, speaks to just the power of psychology in achievement. The fact that, sort of how you think and what your perceptions are and what you believe really has a fundamental sort of role in kind of contemporary kinds of things. Sometimes people can luck themselves into certain situations. We've all had luck. Luck, an old teacher told me, luck is when preparation meets opportunity, and we've all had luck. But at the same time, the degrees of luck that you experience are relative to where you are and how you are thinking about yourself. If you were to track human performance on a scale from 1 to 100, so say somebody's at a 25, 30, you might luck yourself into a 35, 40. You're not going to luck yourself from 25 to 90 unless you see it in your mind, unless you could really believe that you can do those things. That's why, actually, I believe institutions like this, places like this, are so powerful, because it opens horizons and it just empowers people to think of other things and to consider other things and to know other things that add value to people's lives. But this notion of believing in yourself and seeing certain things, I've had a number of instances where I saw that in real life. I think the first time that I really saw this up close, I got an MBA at Duke University, and a group of us did some sort of local community, social action kinds of things. And we found a woman who was in serious need. She was in her young 20s. She had a 4-year-old son. She lived in a trailer that was just particularly bad shape. There were holes in it, and it was just in very bad shape. And we found, she was a nurse's aide, we found a program that could actually get her a new house. It was a tiny house. It was only a few hundred square feet, a couple of rooms, and a kitchen and of course, bathroom. But she could afford it, and it would have been an enormous night and day sort of change for her. But in her mind, it was too risky. She couldn't do it. nobody in her family had ever owned a house. She's a single mother. She's responsible for her little son. And so for her, having a house, the emotional context of that was just too much for her. She was responsible for her son. If anything happened, then, they'd be out. So she declined the opportunity. And so in my mind, that sort of set it out. Yeah, she couldn't see herself as a homeowner and couldn't see herself in this new house. And so that really set up a sort of a wall around what her immediate future was. As the title of this little talk or whatever, was really inspired by a quote that is attributed to Winston Churchill. The farther you can look back, the farther you can see ahead. And, that is such to me, a profound statement because it's so important. African Americans in this country have had some real challenges with that dynamic in general. Prior to 1870, the names of enslaved people were not listed in the United States Census. So to be able to track your history beyond that, you've got to be a little bit of a sleuth and detective and piece together bits of information. It's very, very difficult. And then, of course, up until DNA testing became a reality, and popular in the last decade or so, it was almost impossible for people of African descent to know where on the continent of Africa their DNA originates from. So if it's true that it's important to know where you came from, Abe Lincoln said that you got to know where you came from to know what to do next. If that's important, then for African Americans, there's been a real profound obstacle to that because we could only go back so far. Most African Americans that I know can only go back maybe a couple of generations. Maybe they know about a great-grandparent. Maybe they've got a name of a great-great-grandparent, but it's very difficult. And their history, our history, sort of bookends in a period of time when we were considered chattel. We were owned by other people. So that's not a particularly glorious or enthusiastic start to one's history. So that's why I think it's important that institutions like the Smithsonian D.C. Anybody had a chance to go see that yet? Really amazing place. For this group, and particularly since sort of you self-selected and you're here, I really recommend going to see the new Smithsonian. It's an amazing experience. Soon to be perhaps overcome by the new museum in Charleston, but it's important. And for me personally, I approach this notion of history from an extremely privileged standpoint. Again, I know who my great-great-grandfather was. I know about his mother. I know that his grandmother was the first on that line of people in my family to come to America. She landed in Charleston in the late 1780s or so, and then ended up about an hour and a half further south in a place called Ladies Island down by Beaufort. But because I knew a bit more about my history, that had a profound impact in so many ways. I grew up in the 1970s, late 60s, 70s in Boston. Boston at that time was kind of a challenging place around issues of race. Forced busing was the big thing, and so it created just a lot of tension around race. And for me, on a regular basis, almost weekly, I was affronted around issues of race. I was called the N-word. I was either ignored in a store or followed around in the store, or just anything that you can imagine. And so it really challenged my sense of self. And had I not known about Robert Smalls, had I not known that coursing through my veins was the blood of someone who had overcome obstacles far greater than I would ever, then had I not had that, then I think that would have had a major sort of impact on the trajectory of my life. But because I knew about him, that was important. And that's why I gravitated really to this role in trying to build this museum. As I mentioned before, history empowers narrative. And, there are lots of narratives out there. There's a narrative that has said, that's thankfully is dying, that has said that women and girls aren't good at math and science. That's ridiculous. But the power of that narrative has had an impact that now there are less women in the hard sciences and in math than there should be. Society helped to create the context for contemporary sort of activities. There are lots of ways that sort of these narratives impacted, I think, African American lives. This country has always been a Christian nation, a moral nation, a just nation. And so for it to do the things that it did to first the native people here, but then to the enslaved people, it had to dehumanize those people, right? It had to strip away from them their sense of humanity that would have made them appear. And that, by doing that, that allowed them to, in the case of enslaved people, to, oppress them, to exploit them, to rape them, murder them, torture them for hundreds of years. Why? Simply to make a buck. And that's a long time ago. Slavery was a long, long time ago. But we live today with the echoes of those narratives. We never had a truth and reconciliation kind of a process where the country came together and dealt with issues in a way that South Africa at least attempted to do. And so a lot of these dehumanizing, I will say, sort of ideas about African Americans, again, the echoes of them are still in play. I think about, most perniciously, I think about, all right, I think about, the police violence. And I recognize that police have the most difficult job on the planet. And they never know from moment to moment what's going to be thrown in front of them. But I think about the ways that police are trained or respond to perceived threats. And in many instances, particularly with black men, that ends up with those black men being dead. I think about, there's a young man, 12 years old in Ohio, Tremere Rice. He was on a playground playing with a plastic toy gun. Someone called the cops. Police rolled up, and many of you have probably seen the video. In less than 2.5 seconds, the police officer made the judgment that his life was in danger, and he took that child's life. And that happens. And why does that happen? Because, the narrative around African Americans, in particular African American men, has been that we are beasts of burden, that we are less than human somehow. And again, this is 2019, so it's a different time and place, but we're still dealing with that. I think about, the contrast of how mass murderers, most of whom happen to be white, how they are dealt with. I think about in my city, our offices right now are right directly across the street from Mother Emanuel Church, where 9 people were killed. I think about, Dylan Roof, who went in and spent an hour with them and then unzipped his pouch, pulled out a gun, and killed 9 people. And when they found him, they mass murder, treated him with respect, and actually took him to Burger King because he was hungry. Tremere Rice and many others don't get the benefit of that doubt. And again, in some ways, I think it's a function of the narrative that continues to persist out there. It's funny, I'll just mention, we all have coping mechanisms for different things in our lives and different stresses and the like. And I've been really, really blessed in my life. I've had some amazing jobs. I've lived in some wonderful communities. And I just chose to sort of take things in stride, affronts like that, and to just have a sense of humor about it. But the part of the narrative is that, well, if you're in a nice neighborhood and African American, they must either be an athlete or an entertainer, right? Or something else. And I can't tell you how many times, I've been out cutting my lawn on my lot with my house, and someone comes up and says, excuse me, what are your rates? I'm like, excuse me? He says, yeah, we're new in town and we need, or even more, this happened, the last time this happened, I'm 57, I mentioned. The last time this happened was maybe 3 years ago. People come up and say, oh, hey, what team do you play on? And again, I choose to embrace that with a sense of humor and smile, and because I don't think the vast majority of these kinds of things, they're not malicious. It's just there is this narrative that permeates how people think. And so that's why, again, I think it's so important that we add to the narrative. Not take away, but add to the narrative in a way that can help inform these. I want to tell you a little bit about Robert Smalls and how and why that had a really distinct influence on me. So Robert Smalls was born in 1839, I mentioned, in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was enslaved, of course. He was the son of a domestic for the master and their family. So he was born in a little shack behind the big house. And to make a long story short, when he was 12 years old, they sent him to then the big city, sent him to Charleston. He had been getting in trouble. He was, it is said that he grew up around the children and grandchildren of the master and, rebelled against things like curfew or things like it being illegal for him to know how to be taught how to read and write and other kinds of things. And so they sent him away to get him out of trouble. And he did odd jobs at first, but he always had a passion for the water, passion for the docks. And he ended up working on a boat called the Planter, which when the Civil War broke out was taken into the sort of use of the Confederate Army. And at that time, he was in his young 20s, was married, had 2 young children, among them my great-grandmother Elizabeth. And he had petitioned his wife's master to marry his wife and was allowed to do that. But he knew that in an instant, he could be sold away from his family. And obviously, for any of us who have families, that is an unthinkable kind of a consequence. And so the first thing he did was he negotiated to try to buy their freedom. He worked on the docks, he worked on the Planter, he sent his salary back to his master, but his master allowed him to keep $1 a month or something like that, a small pittance. But he saved every penny of that, and he actually bought goods. He bought tobacco and other sundries, candy and the like, and sold that on the docks and made more money. He's very entrepreneurial. And he put down $100 down payment on the life of his family to try to buy their freedom. Now, it would have been interesting had he gone through with that, because at that time, enslaved people weren't allowed to own assets. But he was doing what he thought he could do to try to shield his family from being sold. But he also noticed the comings and goings of the Confederate crew. He noticed that there were times that at night the Confederate crew left the boat, sometimes not to come back till the next morning. He also knew, those of you who've been to Charleston, you can look out the harbor on the Cooper Riverside and you can see Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began. And right beyond Fort Sumter at that time was a Union blockade. And he knew that if he could get to this blockade, that he'd be free. And so, make a long story short, on the morning of May 13th, 1862, the Confederate crew left. Robert got his family, got the other enslaved crew and their families. He donned this straw hat and this top coat that the Confederate captain wore. Robert was the pilot of the boat at this time, so he knew how to maneuver the boat. He knew all of the passcodes to get by the forts. And so he backed out and headed out. After every fort, there were 5 or 6 forts in the harbor. He knew the passcodes on the whistle. He executed those perfectly. And the last obstacle was Fort Sumter, which was by far the biggest and most dangerous fort in the harbor. And I've often wondered, what must they have thought and felt as they approached Fort Sumter and then just gingerly passed by? Because freedom was right there. It was, in viewing distance. But yet at the same time, they knew that the cannons of Fort Sumter were particularly powerful and long, and that if anything happened, they'd be blown out of the water in an instant. They also made the commitment to themselves, my great-great-grandfather and his wife Hannah, that if anything happened, they would perish right there. They would blow the boat up. They lined the bottom of the boat with dynamite. They knew that if they got caught, that they would be not just killed, but tortured in a particularly public way as an example to others who might have a similar idea. So they lined the boat. And so they passed by Fort Sumter, waited until they believed they were beyond the length of the cannons, and then quickly veered south toward the Union blockade. At that time, the cannons at Fort Sumter, they knew something was wrong, and they trained their sights on the planter and fired, but thankfully it was beyond, the boat was beyond the distance. I wouldn't be here had that not been the case. And they got to the USS Onward, which was the boat where the general, the admiral was SF DuPont from the DuPont family, and they were free. And so again, to make a long story short, Robert came back to fight in the Union Army. He was actually received in the North as a real hero, one of the first heroes of the Civil War. There were reports, newspaper reports of parades, in Washington, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. He could have lived a comfortable life. He got a reward for delivering this boat, and all that, by the way, I didn't mention was full, had just been packed full of munitions and cannons and the like. But he wanted to come back. He had won freedom for himself, but he wanted to fight for the freedom of others. So he came back to fight, became the captain of the planter, was the most senior African American to serve in the Civil War on the Union side, of course. Fought in 18 battles. He then, after the war, he went back to his hometown in Beaufort and was elected to the legislature, to the House and to the Senate. And while there, he wrote the legislation that created the public school system in South Carolina, which was the first free, compulsory, statewide public school system in America. And he wrote the legislation for that. He then became one of the first African Americans to be elected to the United States House of Representatives, went to Washington, served 5 terms, longer than any other African American during that period, and lived a life of consequence. And so I grew up with Robert Small's grandchildren. My grandmother, who was born in 1897, was his granddaughter and her siblings. And so I heard, first person accounts of him, who he was as a human being. Some people in some parts of the country call him general because he became a major general in the South Carolina militia. Other people call him congressman. We called him Grandpa. He was our, the patriarch of our family. And so growing up with that and growing up with those people, it just filled me with a sense of self, with a sense of self-esteem. It fortified my backbone in ways that continue to this day. I often think about when I've got various challenges in my life, and I think, how does this challenge compare to what Robert Smalls dealt with? And if he dealt with his challenge with such aplomb and grace and courage, what am I worried about? I've got to give it a go. But this is the kind of history, talking about the narrative, this is the kind of history and the kind of narrative that is extraordinarily rare for people of African descent. People can't make these kinds of connections. The history is there, the stories are there, but they've not been elevated in a way that is commensurate with their impact. I, I mentioned I was in Boston in the 70s. My parents left the South in the 50s to go to school, and so I grew up outside of Boston. And I got a very New England-centric view of history. Pretty much if it didn't happen north of the Mason-Dixon line, wasn't really important. And it took me, as a grown adult in this project to go to Charleston to learn some really profound things. Charleston was the richest city in America for a century, for 100 years. We're not that old of a nation. But Charleston was the richest city. Why? Because of slavery, but even more deeply because of rice. Of course, people from Europe who came brought wealth with them, but rice was the first real cash crop of America. And there was no rice industry in this country until folks largely, of course from West Africa, but largely from Sierra Leone and that area, brought with them the ingenuity of how to do that. And there is this kind of misconception or this kind of lazy thinking about enslaved people that it was just brute force that they brought with them. But let's use our logic, Slavery was a business. The people who were brought here specifically because they could be monetized in the most aggressive way. And so they brought people with all kinds of trades and with all kinds of expertise. And as this related to rice, rice manufacture is the folks from Africa brought with them the ingenuity of how to manage the tides, of how to create these intricate locks and dams in these rice fields. And again, that created the first sort of round, sort of the venture capital of the American economy. And that part of the story is not often told, but needs to be. It's, we're this unique amalgam of people from all over the world. And I think the richness of our experiment is when we celebrate all of that diversity. And it's important that the historical narrative do that. So lastly, really quick, I know I'm running out of time and I appreciate your patience. All of this sort of led me to an opportunity to lead the International African American Museum. I was invited onto the board of this institution about 7 years ago. About 4.5 years ago or so, then Mayor Joe Riley, who had been in office for 40 years, and had been thinking about this museum. Now it's been 19, almost 20. But he said, hey, Michael, you've got such a passion for this history. You have such connections here in Charleston. Can you come lend all of that to this project to get us across the finish line? And it's been an amazing labor of love to do this work, in part because of those connections, but also in part because I'm just so filled with the opportunity of elevating these stories and sharing them with a broader group of people to help them kind of have a similar sense about themselves as I had growing up. So the museum is, it's not the, it's a decent sized museum. It's about 47,000 square feet. It's long and narrow. It's right on the Cooper River, just a little bit south of the South Carolina Aquarium, for those of you who know Charleston. It is 130 yards long, about 82 feet wide. It's raised off the ground 14 feet. And it happens to be located on the site where almost half of all the enslaved Africans who came to America throughout the entire transatlantic slave trade, where they took their first steps. So there are obviously some real profound differences between this place, which is called Gadsden's Wharf, and let's say Ellis Island. But from the standpoint of that being one place where people can look to where their original ancestors came, this is it. We've done the sort of genealogical work, and there's a greater than 99% probability that all living African Americans have at least one relative among the 48.1% who landed on the site of our museum. So it's a powerful frame. And we're going to tell the stories, not just of those who arrive. We want to tell a little bit more, provide a little context and of the people, talk about where they came from, humanize them in a way that celebrates their contributions, their cultures, their languages. But then we'll talk about the just incalculable sacrifices and contributions that they've made in building this nation, and building the Low Country, and spreading out all throughout the Americas. We've been able to pull together an amazing world-class team. Our design architect, you may have heard I.M. Pei passed not too long ago. It's his firm, Pei Cobb Freed. Our exhibition design firm, museum design firm, is a company called Ralph Applebaum Associates. They're the best museum designers in the world. They did the African American Museum in D.C. They did the Holocaust Museum, the Clinton Library. They're working on the Obama Library now. So we're fortunate to have them. We've got an amazing landscape architect, Walter Hood, who's created installations all around the world. This is going to be a really world-class place that will shine brightly not only on South Carolina, but really on our nation. It's international in scope. There's very strong connections. I mentioned Sierra Leone. We'll talk about that connection. We'll talk about the fact that the people who founded the capital of Sierra Leone, a city called Freetown, were Charlestonians. A group of formerly enslaved Africans left with the British in the 1780s after the Revolutionary War, went to Nova Scotia, didn't quite find the weather there to their liking, and then went to Sierra Leone and founded the city of Freetown. The oldest university in sub-Saharan Africa, a university called Furubay College, Furubay University, its first president was a Charlestonian, one of the first African Americans to graduate from college, and then went over to Sierra Leone and was the president of that university. I had an opportunity in February to go visit Sierra Leone, which was amazing on a lot of fronts, but two of the more profound experiences. One is, again, our site is a site of landing. It's where folks landed. And I had an opportunity to go to a place called Bunce Island, which is an island in the harbor of Freetown. And it was one of the more important places of embarkation, where folks got on the boats. And I got on this stone jetty that's still there, where they used to march the captives down. And I stood on the spot, likely, where an ancestor of mine would have taken their last steps in Africa a couple 100 years ago. And I looked out over the horizon, and I imagined seeing the site of our museum, because that was the direct connection. And so we're working hard. We see enormous opportunity, and again, I think we're in a world now where it's particularly partisan. It's particularly, we sort of put ourselves in various corners, and there's not a lot of conversation between those. But I think we all can move forward, and we all can grow, and we all can, this sounds corny, but become better Americans if we understand a little bit more about all of our history and understand the impact that history has on contemporary time. So I appreciate your time. It's been wonderful, and I look forward to sticking around for a little bit.
Thank you very much, Michael. If you have a question for him, if you could start to line up at the microphones. And while you're doing that, I just had one more announcement. I mentioned this is the 6th of 9 presentations, and you get a sense that we're trying to tell stories. Michael talked about narratives and how they impact our thinking going forward, and we need and next week's speaker is Dr. Frank Thomas, and he's going to talk about the power of African American preaching, the history of African American preachers over the last 400 years. The week after that, week 8, Dr. Stan Deaton, who is a friend of mine, who's the chief historian at the Georgia Historical Society, is going to come and talk about Confederate monuments. And this is going to be a stunningly interesting presentation. And for those of you who are of the school that you should just tear them all down, hold on. Frank is going to give a very reasoned presentation about why they were built, when they were built, who built them, and ask a lot of provocative questions and let you come to your own judgments about how to address monuments in your own cities if you're fortunate or unfortunate enough to have those. I live in Atlanta, and we seem to be blessed with them as well. Our last week, of course, week 9, is Wynton Marsalis week here. And it will be a lively week, and our speaker that week is a performer. Dr. Alex Harris, who runs the Arts Conservatory for Teens program in St. Petersburg, Florida. And it's going to be a busy week. He's going to be here all week. Sorry, Michael, we only gave you one day or so. But he will be here with a number of his colleagues. He will speak on Wednesday. They will do the family entertainment series. I believe that's on Tuesday evening, and some workshops during the week as well to complement a lot of the things that Wynton and his crew are doing. So let me start, since I have this microphone, with the first question, which is when will the museum open and what's the timetable for it?
Thank you for the question. Had I been on my game, I would have, of course, offered that information. But we're breaking ground any moment now. We ended up having to raise about $115 million. And because we're connected to the city of Charleston, we had to raise 100% of the money before we could begin construction. We couldn't take out a mortgage. And so we've got that, and we are about to break ground. It's about a 2-year construction cycle. So it will open fall 2021, bearing any hurricane or anything like that. So yeah. Should we
just
go the lady? Yeah, we'll just go back and forth. Okay.
Thank you so much for your comments. They were just to my heart, and I try to teach my children those kinds of things. I was curious, is your museum going to be looking at the contributions that Africans brought to this nation with regards to inoculation? I was learning that that was the Africans who showed the Europeans, the Americans, the way to bring, with smallpox, to make a cut and put it in. It was considered blasphemy and crazy black magic, but people were dying, and the white colonists were desperate, and that's one of the ways that they learned that. And there's been some recent history that show that this is really true, and white doctors had written about this, and the white doctors, of course, are famous. But the slaves that they got the information from have been forgotten by. So I didn't know if you were going to touch into that. And also, are you going to be working at all with Brian Stevenson with his lynching museum?
So let me answer the second one. That'll be a quicker answer. We've got a nice relationship with them, and I'm sure from a programmatic standpoint we'll be doing things. And I really look forward to that. So to answer your question, the first question, I'm not sure whether the specific notion of inoculation will be covered. We've got lots of media. We've got 41 media screens throughout the museum, and so that gives us an opportunity to program all sorts of new things and keep things fresh, and that's certainly a point that's worthy of inclusion. But we're going to talk about the broader point of contributions that people of African descent have made. For example, there is something called an Ishango bone. It was discovered, I think, maybe 25,000 years ago, and it is the bone of a baboon that had carvings, and those carvings happen to be prime numbers. And so it indicates very, very early kind of understanding of mathematics and the like. So we'll for sure be celebrating those kinds of things. Thank you for the question. Sir?
Thank you for being here. Great message. Can't wait to come to your new museum someday.
Thank you.
I'm from Minnesota, and I'm continually surprised at the number of people I meet who were Obama supporters, voted for Hillary, but still make comments that I think are, my gosh, how could you say that? Is there a gentle way that I can get them to think and reframe the question somehow Because, yes, the Civil War ended in the 1860s, but they don't understand anything that has happened in between. And how do I get them to realize that it's like, oh, here he goes again, another issue, another cause? But is there a few sentence way, what would you recommend, please?
First of all, thank you for the question. I think it's a thoughtful and it's a really meaningful question. And I'm not sure that there is a set talking point other than just not to be afraid to articulate your perspective. When you hear something that doesn't jive with your understanding about this or anything, I think feel empowered to, in the way that you think makes sense to you, to just push back on that. You know, Martin Luther King talked about, and many have talked about the silence of good people. And so not getting political, but, you know, I think this is a time when it's important for people to step up and to share their points of view in whatever ways that make sense.
Yes. Just last thing, as I'm aging, I'm becoming more and more like my dad, and never afraid to speak up and speak out. But just, I don't want to offend people and get them upset or turned off. But anyway, thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, the last thing I would just say is that we've got to be careful not to privilege potentially offending someone in your circle over sort of doing the right thing and the truth. And hello.
I'm really looking forward to visiting your museum, and I certainly enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, how do you feel about the issue of reparations?
Reparations.
Reparations.
Well, let me just say the museum is not taking a formal position on that. We're telling stories and presenting information and letting people sort of discover that themselves. But I would just say, A, it's an extraordinarily complicated question.
Yes.
But B, it is worthy of serious conversation. And, you know, if one group was enriched for hundreds of years on the backs of another group, and then when that ended, there were all kinds of societal programs put in place, like the fact that, you know, the GI Bill largely was outside of the purview of African Americans, and we know about redlining and the like. And so if we care about fairness and equity, then something needs to happen. That's the best way to say it.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much for bringing this marvelous message to us. I was very interested in your trying to bring, not to change the narrative, but to bring a more authentic narrative, have to actually add to it. Now, the American narrative of American exceptionalism is kind of firmly established amongst all of us, really, and that we are the beacon of democracy in the world. How do we graft on this more authentic narrative to this narrative without throwing out the whole idea of this being beacon?
I think America is a great nation, but I think that our history is complicated, and I think that we have to acknowledge things like the sacrifices of our native brothers and sisters first, and the sacrifices of people of African descent and all around. So I think it's by acknowledging those complexities, let's say, I don't think that necessarily takes away from our greatness. I think it just adds to a sense of honesty about who we are and how we got here. And so I think we move forward. I think we become greater by elevating all of these histories and their realities. That's a great question. Sir.
Hey there. Firstly, I want to pray for your experience tomorrow morning with Amtrak.
Oh, no.
That you do get to New York City on the same day.
Oh, my goodness.
And that it doesn't get in your way of coming back here another time.
Oh, my goodness. Sounds like I should know something here. Uh-oh.
As I've listened to you, I've been trying to think through how you'll position the new museum in comparison to the African American History Museum in D.C. And the Slave Mart Museum in Charleston. And your parallel with Ellis Island helped a lot in thinking that through. I wonder how else you think about differentiating.
Well, and that's a great question as well. We are telling complementary stories in the same way that there are art museums everywhere, or there are various history museums everywhere. Each of them may be grounding themselves a little bit in their location or in some part of the story and telling them. We happen to have the benefit of telling the story on the spot where, for most, that history began. And so that gives us, I think, one sense of differentiation with the Smithsonian. Another, I talked about Sierra Leone and the international aspect. We will dive into sort of Africa and its civilizations and the people in ways that are beyond, I think, what the National Museum does. The other thing, we have a very, very powerful, I talked about how challenging it can be for African Americans to do family search, to connect with their past. We've got a really wonderful Center for Family History that we are empowering to really be the preeminent sort of space for African American family search in the country, in the world. And so throughout the rest of the museum, we'll be telling these broad stories about African American history, but the Center for Family History is a place where people can personalize that story, where they can find their personal strand of this history and reconnect in a personal way to all of this history. And so I think that will be different. In terms of the Slave Mart Museum, there are some logistical differences. Slave Mart Museum is smaller than this space for sure. And it was a space where sort of the aftermarket, the legal importation of enslaved people ended December 31st, 1807. What was called Ryan's Mart, the old Slave Mart Museum, that space really became a place, sort of an aftermarket sales, after. And they have a connection to the city. We have a connection to the city. So practically, I'm sure we will partner to varying degrees, going forward. So yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'll start out. Portions of my question have kind of been framed, but the timing of this narrative that we're speaking of that is so important, and particularly in today's climate. How, and I'm hoping with your background in marketing, you've got an answer for this, how we can speed up the process of the narrative, because I have noted personally that among educated or curious people that reach out to help embrace narrative, but is a smaller minority to the larger masses in bringing this forward. And when we say slavery was 100 years ago, we're actually talking about 200 years ago. And it's been 100 years that even thinking that you're a sports star in your own neighborhood, that those before you fortunately built at least that they can be in the neighborhood. And now it has to go marching forward. And I suppose I'm an impatient sort, but I want to hear how we're going to move this forward quickly, that we're not going to lose any more time.
No short answer for that.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King said, people of goodwill, of good sort of consciousness, must each find the type of protest that best fits with who they are, with their convictions, but protest we all must. And I don't think he just meant, walking with a sign or whatever. And particularly in these days, someone asked the question about how does he talk to people around him. I think it's just having the courage to talk about these things, particularly amongst peers and people who kind of let their hair down and will say things. I think that's how it happens. I think there is a growing thirst, particularly around African American history. I think it started with the opening of the Smithsonian Museum in D.C. and the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, and there's a new museum in Mississippi and in New Orleans. I think our museum will contribute to that. So I think, and by the way, this thirst is not just among African Americans. I mean, we're expecting far more people who aren't African American to be visitors to our museum than who will. So I think it's paying attention. It's coming to things like this. It's talking to your colleagues and your friends.
Let me follow that up. Has it been proposed for school districts, certainly in your area, because taking them when they're young and
Yeah, we are definitely, we've got a very strong education component to what we're doing. We're building K through 12 curricula. We're creating toolkits for teachers to help them teach this history. We're creating, we won't probably open with this, but we're planning residential kinds of experiences, summer experiences for teachers that when they're not, right after they leave here, they come down to Charleston and can learn this history. So yeah, I think the education piece is absolutely critical.
so your marketing background is helping. Yes.
Hi there. I'm wondering, so my kids' elementary school in St. Louis on Black History Month, the one teacher had a sign that said, slaves weren't stolen from Africa, doctors and teachers and farmers, and kind of recreating that narrative. And when I had read more beautiful something history, I can't remember, but it was talking about how the civil rights movement has become almost now owned by white, anti-racist or whatever. So my question is, how do we balance out the need to talk about injustices that are happening without also, as I've observed in white, well-meaning people, a sense of supremacy to that still colonial, we're saving you, that type of narrative? How do we balance those two things out? Somebody was commenting that all the Facebook videos of black men being brutalized has become almost like postcards of lynchings. There's this almost pornography to it. So how do we balance the injustice without it also being this, white savior type of...
Yeah, man, this crowd, these amazing questions. Thank you. Not surprised. Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. I think there's a lot of nuances to that. I've seen a number of instances of that in Charleston where, what typically are described as allies have a vision for something, and sometimes that's not quite in concert with the people at the center of the issue. But I just think it's the more that we can, as Americans, as human beings, that we can talk about issues that are uncomfortable. We live in a world where it's challenging to talk about things that are uncomfortable. Race, it doesn't get much more uncomfortable in this country, but that's how we move forward. To have those kinds of conversations. I always tell my kids that, their comfort zone is like this now, but eventually to be able to do the things they need to do in their lives, it's got to be, as big as this room. And that means that everything outside of that comfort zone, it's uncomfortable. But they have to just get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think, to simplify grossly, I think that's largely what it is. It's a combination of the number of answers I had over here and just having the courage in polite company to talk about these issues and that they're important. And it's not, that they're important. So, but thank you.
There's a narrative that I'd like you to comment on, something that kind of concerns me. In this day and age, you have more of a loss of faith, and one thing that's coming to replace it is science and scientism. But one of the major narratives in science is the theory of evolution. And I'm concerned about that because the last time they started using that as a major narrative, you ended up with eugenics. It seems to me that you can't, if you're going to build a morality on science, and if it involves evolution, we're going back to trouble again. What do you think?
Uh,
That's it for an easy question.
yeah, honestly, that question's above my pay grade. I'm not going to punt on it. I have an opinion, but I mean, I think again, I think people connecting with people in safe kinds of places like this. I mean, I think this is such a, a metaphor for what needs to happen all around the country, all around the world. So yeah, you got me on that one.
I have a couple things. Number one, I've been at Beaufort and have learned about your grandfather and all the other wonderful stories there. In the past year, I've been involved with the Underground Railroad. We got a grant to do some work at Fort Gadsden, or Negro Fort, on the Apalachicola River. It is a wonderful story. It was one of the very early communities in 1813, 1814 of Maroons, which were African American freed slaves and also Native Americans. And in looking at that and just did an archaeological dig this spring. There's so many wonderful things that we're finding out, which needs to be a story told. My second grade grandson thinks that the Underground Railroad went north. This did not. This went south to Apalachicola and then on out. So what I'm trying to say is this narrative needs to be told. Everybody needs to know about this wonderful, thriving community of freed slaves. They got their freedom through being with the British and working with the British in the military. And people need to know about this. This was a wonderful thing going on in Florida. Yeah. Now, of course, those who knew the story know the tragic end of it. But these are the things that need to get out, need to get into history books.
Yeah, there are so many stories like that need to be told. You're absolutely right. There were a lot of people, particularly from the Carolinas and everything, who they didn't go north. They went south to Florida to be free.
That's right.
But nobody knows that. Another story that I think is important, everyone now is talking about 1619, the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved people. There were enslaved folks with the Spanish here 100 years before that. But we're getting the British story. We're getting their story, the Jamestown story. So lots of things.
Yeah, I'm going to stop it at the end. The gentleman on the end and the lady on the end.
Sorry?
Yeah, go ahead.
I've been in the arts and humanities my entire life, and I believe that those two things celebrate the dignity of the human body and the human soul. I come from the dance world, so we talk a lot about body reflecting the soul. I'm also an avid reader, and I want to know if you have some suggestions. I mean, I've read Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns, Bryan Stevenson, as well as some fabulous fiction that's been written within the last 10 years, with beautiful narratives about African American experiences. Any suggestions above and beyond what I might have already read?
Yeah, I actually have an interesting book for all of you that dovetails very nicely on this conversation. It's called Denmark Vesey's Garden. Denmark Vesey, V-E-C-E-Y, Denmark Vesey's Garden. I don't remember, it's two husband and wife team of academics from the West Coast. But in any event, it looks at the narrative of Charleston and how it developed and how and why strategically certain aspects of the history were privileged and emphasized and others were subordinated and just what that has meant. It's a really fascinating, I think, look at just history and how it develops and some of the things that I've talked about. I think it's Denmark Vesey's Garden. Garden. V-E-C-E-Y-S. Yeah, let me just look it up here. Yeah, okay.
Hi.
Yeah.
I have so many questions.
Oh, boy.
But I'm not going. I like, how you say that history has created this narrative. And I don't have to remind you or anybody that the civil rights movement wasn't until the 1960s and how voting rights and all that. we're all readers, or I speak for all of us here. I mean, Colson Whitehead's new book has gotten tremendous press. He has uncovered something awful in this new fiction of his, The Nickel Boys. And I read Coates, and I read, I've seen Jacob Lawrence's work, and I've taught Native Son and all of those things. And I'm glad to hear that part of what you're doing is, education programs to get kids involved in this. But it's the media that it has a pervasive effect on most of America. And there was a great deal of controversy around the Green Book. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what your feelings were, specifically maybe about that and some of the others. I mean, Hidden Figures was a wonderful story, and there are so many. I remember the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. I mean, who could not? Mm-hmm. So they're through literature and talking about how people suffer and what hurt does, just has to be more, and of course Henry Louis Gates, the work that he does. I mean, he's always been my idol. And so there is so much out there, and yet it doesn't seem to penetrate the narrative. And so that's my frustration.
Yeah, I think it's all additive. I think that there is more content about this history out now than there's ever been. Henry Louis Gates had a great documentary. I don't know if you saw it, about Reconstruction, that was out maybe February. I was in it. But I think it's additive, and I think it, slowly but surely, institutions like ours, like the Smithsonian, will come up. So I just think it takes time.
Okay, we have 3 questions. One here, 2 there.
Only one of them's mine, though. And maybe this is addressing the elephant in the room. But so I've been here in Chautauqua for about 3-4 days now, and I was here once before a few years ago. And I'm more struck now than I was then. Maybe I've become more sensitized that there aren't more people of color or racial diversity attending these events. We talk about diversity, we talk about inclusivity, and you're probably not the person who's going to be able to answer this question because you're a guest, but him, yes. Sorry, sir, I forgot your name. But what attempts are being made, what attempts can be made to make this place really what it should be? Thank you.
I'm always pleased to say, I'm so pleased you asked that question. The purpose of the African American Heritage House is, in fact, to make this a more welcoming place for all people. And the real question is, if you are African American and you do not wish to come here and stand out and be a novelty, or be asked, are you singing in the group tonight? Or have your wife ask, are you the cleaning lady? Which has happened here. We have to provide a reason for them to come here. As I look at, as we and our board have looked at the experience of Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard, that's a result of 100 years of effort there to create robust African American communities there. And so our goal is to provide a reason. And our first, and again, this is our first speaker series, and so we will provide sustainable programming around social justice issues informed by the African American experience. We will also work with the administration in their strategic planning and on their outreach. In today's world of marketing, it is no longer acceptable to just open your door and say, hi, I'm Chautauqua, I'm great, come on down. It doesn't work that way anymore. And so, again, we are working with the administration. We will be starting joint planning with them in the fall after the season ends. I hope that addresses your issue. And Denmark Vesey,
I've got the book here.
Okay.
Yeah. So quickly, thank you for that, Errol. It's the book that we're talking about is Denmark Vesey's Garden, Slavery and Memory in the Cradle of the Confederacy. It's by Ethan Keitel and Blaine Roberts. K-Y-T-L-E. Denmark Vesey, V-E-S-E-Y apostrophe S, Denmark Vesey's Garden, Keitel and Roberts. It's a great book.
Last two.
Mr. Moore, has your planning operation included the possibility of a feedback loop for communities which go beyond educating and talking and actually have some success in implementing programs on behalf of increasing diversity, and how that might be tied back into their experience at the museum?
Another great question. Mayor Riley announced his vision for this museum in his State of the City address in the year 2000. From 2000 to probably 2015, community folks, activists, people, chaired by Congressman Clyburn, basically came up with all of the sort of inputs about what kind of a museum it would be, where it would be, what it would be called, what the experience would be, what the stories would be. And so that has informed things. From probably when I got involved maybe 4 years ago up until about 9 months ago, we had the Herculean task of raising all this money. And so that we didn't have staff really, we were just raising money. We've now hired staff, and we've now had a number of community events, and we have developed a strategy and a set of programs to engage. So it's extraordinarily important that we engage with our communities, because it's not just Charleston or even the Low Country or even this country. We've got constituents, continent of Africa, who we also are seeking input from and engagement with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Last question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moore, for what you had to say.
Thank you.
I have a single question. We in America will be blessed with 2 great national museums dedicated to a forced immigration. Mm-hmm. Are there, to your knowledge, any other similar museums, perhaps Australia, or conversely, what about museums that commemorate emigration? I know of one in Dublin, but wondered if there are others.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure of, around the world. I know that there are, you all will be surprised, probably about 800 African American history museums in this country. Most of them are just little house museums that, get a few thousand visitors. But there is, like I said, there's a growing thirst for this content, for people to know this history, and so, I think these stories are, being elevated, and So
I'll see you in a couple of years.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Michael Moore for a stimulating performance.